The world today seems run by maniacs and idiots, doesn't it? Groups who ask you to beg them to make things right and vote for change and security. Why don't we think we can act on our own ethics? Why must we ask a third party to enact something or use force on another? I mean, in a court, a jury is used to gauge what society deems reasonable behaviour and therefore help judge the accused. Why then are people, when not formed in a jury, judged by government unable to make decisions and guide society by simply being in it? Surely it's self-evident people are society. Or are they? You see, in case you hadn't noticed, we live in a society of half-truths and outright lies. Not from the general public on the whole, but from those that claim to have moral authority. These are the very factions that say to gain their positions they must be made of the very best character and highest moral fibre. But governments clog their speeches with promises they can't or won't fulfill, tell you about a war that must be fought and paid for, while removing the very freedom they claim to be fighting for. Banks lend fictitious multiples of the actual money they hold to you at high interest, while paying you a fraction of interest for the savings that allowed the initial funding to make it all happen. Lawyers seem happy to charge you hundreds of dollars for a letter, and tens of thousands to liaise with the other party through their counterpart on the other side of the dispute. These factions are the very definition of a monopoly. Today, the advantages of corporations over people's rights is too great. The agreements held to in your parents' and grandparents' days have been pushed, relaxed, or downright trampled over because of lack of enough knowledge to stand their ground, all in the name of corporate greed or citizens' protection. All the time you are asked to consent to new rules. Can you sign here you understand what we have explained? Sign here if you have read and understood the terms and conditions. Sign this form for a permit. Vote for me and I'll make it all great again. Of course, they never explain exactly what that entails. Did you read the fine print? What's the alternative? Am I obliged to agree to your terms? What about those grey areas? No, it's all obscured in a list of advantages, whilst never mentioning the disadvantages, unless you're prepared to spend more than a day learning the fine print and legal jargon. I can understand those that just agree, just to give them the time in the day to get through the next list of rules. To be fair though, what advantage is it of a corporation or government to explain all the potential, planned or known negatives if they have your permission to do anything? Somehow, those that make the rules expect us to play the game without knowing much of what we can do as the player. Remember, some of these are the very factions that conveniently fail to provide the quality education they promised. Sure, they offer basic education, but who was ever taught in school of their rights and how the system works? The ones that lied and changed the rules you agreed to, the ones that lied to get into power, the ones that cry democracy and capitalism while bailing out some they deem too big to fail and deny you the choice not to be governed on a so-called democratic voting form. They'd rather give you years spent on basic reading, writing and arithmetic and ironically call it the 3 R's. They would rather give your children's inheritance to corporations under the guise of bailing out the economy with government subsidies, rather than you gaining any family prosperity. Let me compare it to a board game you might find yourself in front of these days. Let's assume you've agreed to try it out and abide by the rules, temporarily forsaking your normal God-given freedoms and judgment in favour of trying something different. Everything is made to appear fair and reasonable. Everyone gets the same cards and the same roll of the die or the same turn of a card. For how else can they ask you to even bother playing? Would anyone sit down to a game of Monopoly if one player started with half of the property and you had a couple of $100? So it seems fun for a bit and a little entertaining. But imagine like a casino, they need a certain number of players to keep it all going, and also their eyes on eventually getting the whole family hooked. So to keep you playing, they offer you food and drink at the table, and you can pay with the earnings from the game. That might keep you there longer, so they do that. And you're so busy trying to deal with the micromanagement of the game, you hardly notice the food getting less and less nutritious, and you getting fatter and less motivated to leave. Now imagine they change some rules to allow them to bring your family into play, and so on for generations. Sure, they have to adjust the rules now and then, Because if too many are unsuccessful or too successful, well, the next generation might be dissuaded from playing. So the rules of each generation are made to nerf most of the last, to create the illusion of a more level playing field. An equivalent might be more land tax, more wage tax, taxes for dying and passing on property to the family, inflation, wage stagnation, and the odd share market or property collapse to make it a bit more interesting. But it's always important to stress the possibility of winning big, with a few pictures about the place of the happy contestants that made it. But among all the tweaking, there are rules that can't be changed, as they might break the mechanics of the game. So no drastic changes can be made to the smooth running of authority or currency, through fear of those who claim sovereignty over you not being able to continue to milk your creativity and work so they might continue. Those who run the enforcement arm can claim their cut as long as they can enforce the new ever stringent rules. Those in banking and finance can do whatever they want with their mates, but can't be too frivolent with currency to the public, as this might spiral out of control, and they have to balance inflation and spending. The government of the time can't be too restrictive or cruel too soon, or people might look for ways out of the game. The main thing is to keep pushing at the boundaries. Sure, they might be ousted for another party which lessens people's anger, but make no mistake, if you're playing a game by rules, it makes no difference if George enforces the rules in his blue shirt, or Julia enforces them in her red shirt. It's the same list of rules they're reading from, and there are ever more of them, day by day. And if someone comes along to try and tip the apple cart by trying to make an alternative to these stringent ideals, like, for instance, trying to create another monetary system, then to quote another popular board game, you'll soon discover the murderer was Mr. Booth in a theatre with a pistol. Unfortunately for us, the modern rules have no choice but to make it harder and harder to get ahead if those at the top are to flourish and make sure their progeny continue in the utmost luxury while those coming into the game perceive some form of fairness for them just to join in. So just as this generation of families are starting to question why they're playing this nonsense at all, they're also beginning to realise the gardens of their grandparents have been left barren too long. Some are beginning to realise that a government can shut their family business on a whim, or stop their income with some ink on a piece of paper, lock them into their homes by decree, tell them who they can buy food from and who they can sell to, tell them they have to accept an injection to participate. Unfortunately, with this realisation, the bulk of the newest generation are realising they don't know how to can produce, how to hunt, how to barter. They no longer remember self-sufficiency, the rules of the real world. Man-made rules have been imposed to dissuade these things from being done again, like not being able to buy raw milk from farmers, penalties for hunting without a license, and now the new oft-repeated phrase of social distancing. Skills of living in the natural world are mostly lost, and the time is ripe for those believing they're in power to now go all in. The tipping point of the populace being fully dependent on the laws of society is here. In fact, with the current restrictions, soon, ironically, monopolies can't help but emerge when all the opposition is either crushed or legislated out of existence. For instance, how is a sandwich bar meant to operate with distancing laws with a small frontage? One customer at a time won't get the revenue they need to continue. The big corporations with a large footprint get to buy up the empty space in a mall and entice all those clients unable to fit in the smaller establishments into theirs, and all this with reduced rental too. The big supermarkets already have large stores with self-serve checkouts, while the small mom-and-pop farmer market doesn't. And did you notice at the start of this current crisis, business was immediately targeted in the initial supports and stimulus? They also appeared first in the queue for handouts and were by far the bulk of payments offered. All this in a capitalist society meant to allow businesses to contract and expand, succeed or fail naturally. All the while, the actual taxpayers were only just starting to realise they may be in need of assistance themselves. You know, the people who actually supply the money for government to spend on their behalf. But the government doesn't need to listen. They are the ultimate too big to fail. They have a guaranteed income as long as there are taxpayers to keep them, and with that comes the arrogance of a millionaire's child talking down to the staff who put their clothes on and cook their meals every day. Ironically though, we may have just been shown something by the meltdown of stars on YouTube, Without the toadying feedback of employees and adulation from the public, they seem adrift, unable to function properly without the continuous fawning and positive reinforcement to show they have meaning and relevance. Perhaps the same could work by turning our backs on a sick society. If nothing else, now is a time for people to realize the ultimate truth. Look around you and realize this is truly nothing but a game. If you've played by the rules all this time, you'll see now that the rules can change at the stroke of a pen, and they must if the game's to continue. For the game masters need it to, or they become irrelevant. We realize now that within this game's rules, anything can be taken away. Our livelihoods are being or have been taken away. Our freedoms are being taken away. The last vestiges of our privacy is being taken away. And soon our homes will probably be taken away. If some of this does not happen, you now know it can happen at any time in the future, such as the power government grants itself. The irony is that those financial gurus that told you over the years to diversify your investments have watched as shares, bank interest, property returns, and everything else, it's all going south at the same time. And when everyone is broke and trying to buy food with what little is left, the Buffetts, Gates, Clintons, and their ilk will come in and mop up for pennies on the dollar. So here we are, staring at the card that's been currently played in the game. It reads, Worldwide Pandemic. Do not move for 6 turns and do not collect income. And so if nothing else, you might take this quarantine time, these 6 turns, to think about what you could do for yourself. Learn to grow edible plants in a pot so you can move them if needed. Gain back some of your self-reliance and maybe learn a skill or two to help you and perhaps to teach others. Because at the end of this, there will probably be only complete, very basic fairness, with everyone back at the start of a new rigged game. Or freedom, but not both. But take heart. The thing about games is no matter how long you've sat playing by someone else's rules, you can still choose not to play. It's an incredibly difficult choice to make, especially when everything you think you have is invested and locked in. Just remember though, ultimately, you could get up, leave everything behind, and walk away. Now, obviously, walking away brings its own problems. There will be pain from muscle atrophy. That'll be hard to overcome. Relearning what was lost over generations will be incredibly hard. And the game masters will keep enticing you with the threat of force or promises of help to gain your custom again. But if you have the determination, try to at least think of doing it by degrees. But do it soon, and as quickly as you can. Get out of debt. Minimize your stuff. Maybe try to live being mobile, like having a block of land and caravans or buses to live in instead of a house that's fixed and easier to take away or tax away. The benefits of living in a metal shell could give you a little protection in a form that Faraday would approve of too, if you catch my drift. Helping keep certain frequencies out. It may not be perfect, but you may sleep easier. So to sum up, authority might get a little rough during a changing of the rules so they can keep you all to themselves. After all, without players, there's no game.